Hi everyone, and welcome to the last podcast of our series dedicated to the impact of a shock on nominal wages with a consumption function that exhibits distribution effects. If we want our shock on nominal wages to have an impact on the demand, we need a consumption function that exhibits distribution effects. This means that the consumption function needs to show the way that the income is distributed across salaried income or waged income and non-salaried income, interests and dividends. Remember that we assume firms distribute the entirety of the income either in the form of wages or in the form of dividends. The term Y minus Wn over P refers to all these non-wage income. Even though it would be difficult to imagine that one household would consume differently two types of revenues, we can still easily imagine two types of households. One that would earn wage income and that would have a consumption function of the type C1 of Wn over P, and one that would earn non-wage income and who would have a consumption function of the type C2 of Y minus Wn over P. Now, remember that the marginal propensity to consume refers to the additional consumption enabled by an additional unit of income. We will assume here that C prime 1 is higher than C prime 2, meaning that the marginal propensity to consume wage income is higher than the marginal propensity to consume non-wage income. Until now, we had implicitly assumed that the two marginal propensities to consume were equal. This was quite unrealistic, as in practice, we do often observe that C prime 1 is higher than C prime 2. In this case, an increase in nominal wages will increase wage income and decrease non-wage income. There will be no effect on the aggregate income, but there will be distribution effects. More wage income, and so less dividends to distribute. Under these assumptions, an increase in W will have an impact on consumption. It will increase a lot because wage income are largely consumed. And it will decrease a little bit because non-wage income are less consumed. The net effect on consumption is positive and the demand increases even though the aggregate income has not changed. This is what we call distribution effects. Different distributions of the same aggregate income will lead to different levels of consumption. Note that in this case, the consumption function will be given by C equals C0 plus C1 of Wn over P, the salaried income, plus C2 of Y minus Wn over P, the non-salaried income. Let's now look at the impact of the shock in the short term. Just as in the previous podcast, the economy is initially at its long-term equilibrium in imperfect competition until happens an exogenous shock on nominal wages, DW0. Prices and wages are fixed in the short term, so the adjustment will be through quantities. The increase in nominal wages leads to an increase in the real wage, so the labor demand and the supply of firms decrease because the real cost of labor has increased. But now we need to add one more thing compared to the previous podcast. The consumption increases because the consumption of wage income increases more than the consumption of non-wage income decreases. In other words, the demand of goods increases. So YD short term is higher than Y0. Graphically, IS shifts to the right because W is not expressed in the axis, but is present in this new IS equation with the consumption function with distribution effects. In the short term, firms adjust to the effective demand. As we suppose, they have an incentive to increase their production, even though they do not maximize their profits. Besides, we see that the interest rate increases, which makes sense. An increase in consumption at constant income means less savings. So a decrease in the supply of loanable funds from the households, which leads to excess demand of loanable funds, and so an increase in the interest rate. Overall, the short-term equilibrium hides an excess demand of goods, which is particularly large as the shock increased the demand and decreased the supply. Given the technical constraints, employment increases compared to the initial situation at a level much higher than the firm's profitable labor demand. Once again, there is still some persisting unemployment in the economy. Finally, we can say that because W and N increase, there is no doubt that the labor payroll, which represents all the wages distributed in the economy, has increased, both in nominal terms, Wn, and in real terms, Wn over P. However, we don't know how the share of the payroll in the GDP varied, because on one hand the payroll increased, but on the other hand the GDP increased as well. In the medium term, the excess demand of goods triggers an increase in prices, which will increase the supply, as usual. For the demand, it's a bit more complex than what we previously dealt with. There are now two effects. The indirect effect that we now know very well, an increase in P, triggers an increase in the interest rate, which pushes down investment and the demand. Graphically, we represent this indirect effect by LM shifting to the left. But we also have a direct effect now. Indeed, P is present in the equation of IS, and an increase in P decreases the wage income and increases by the same amount the non-wage income. Given our assumptions on the marginal propensities to consume these two types of revenues, we observe a decrease in consumption. Graphically, this direct effect shifts IS to the left as P is not expressed in the axis. Overall, the medium-term equilibrium displays a lower output and a higher interest rate compared to the short term. Comparing Y medium-term and the initial Y0, the conclusions are a bit more uncertain. On the graph, we have Y medium-term below Y0. But we can clearly see that this depends on the extent to which the IS and LM curves are shifted. We are not going to demonstrate this here in this podcast, but in practice, we do find that Y medium term is below Y0. The decrease in demand that we observe in the medium term is large enough to bring Y medium term at a lower level than the initial level of production. Intuitively, we could say that this is because the demand reacts twice to the rise in prices in an indirect way through the interest rate and in a direct way through distribution effects. Given the production function and given the decrease in production, employment will logically decrease as well compared to its short-term level and also compared to its initial level. We see once again the apparent paradox of the medium term. Employment decreased, even though the real wage decreased as well. Of course, we still have some persisting unemployment in the economy. In the long term, we will consider, just as we did in the previous podcast, that the increase in nominal wages will lead to an increase in gamma, the negotiated long-term real wage, from gamma to gamma prime. Indeed, considering that gamma would come back to its original value, would mean that households are subject to monetary illusion, that they only negotiated a nominal increase and not a real increase, which is possible, but it's not the assumption that we will make here. Anyway, we saw that in the medium term, because prices increased, the real wage became lower than gamma prime. This triggers an increase in W and an upward wage price spiral until we reach gamma prime. At this level, because the cost of labor has permanently increased, the level of employment is lower than before the shock. Similarly, the supply of goods is lower than the initial level of production. Because the model is dichotomous in the long term, the level of employment and output is decided by the firms, so both variables exhibit lower levels than initially. The increase in prices triggered by the wage price spiral, shifts LM once more to the left, resulting in another increase in the interest rate, which decreases investments and the demand. Also, because the real wage, W over P, increased between medium and long term, the consumption increases, which pushes the demand up. Graphically, IS shifts to the right. We can therefore see two opposite movements that act on the demand. On one hand, a decrease in investment, and on the other hand, an increase in consumption. Despite the increase in consumption, the demand decreases compared to the medium term, and the level of output is set at a lower level of production set by the firm. We are in imperfect competition, so there still is some unemployment in the economy, and even more than in the initial situation. We can conclude that, according to the model, an increase in nominal wages generates unemployment, even with distribution effects. We can finally represent the impact of the shock in the plane YP. Due to the shock, the supply decreases for any level of prices, and the quasi-supply curve pivots to the left. In the short term, at fixed prices, the increase in W in the presence of distribution effects has a positive impact on the demand. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, as W is not expressed in the axis. The short-term equilibrium is set at the level of the short-term demand, but hides an important excess demand. We can see that at the short-term equilibrium, the firm is outside of its supply curve. This excess results in an increase in prices, which increases the supply and decreases the demand, both indirectly through the channel of the interest rate, and here directly through the consumption function with distribution effects. We move along the curves and reach a lower output and higher prices. In the long term, because the real wage became lower than the new negotiated long-term real wage, the nominal wage increases, which leads to two curve movements. The quasi-demand curve shifts to the right, and the quasi-supply curve pivots to the left. Overall, we reach an equilibrium with higher prices and lower output compared to the medium term and compared to the initial situation. The shock generated a decrease in the GDP, as well as high inflation in the economy. Just as the other demand shocks that we studied earlier, the increase in nominal wages did not generate a permanent increase in income. Of course, if the increase in nominal wages would follow an increase in productivity gains, our conclusions would be different, or could be different, and could be closer to what happened between the 1950s and the 1970s.